and the questions that we will be able to hear that would lend to some knowledge and foresight to all of us. We ask your blessing for Pastor Chapman that he get home safely and no interruption or other traffic, and for all other attendees and participants that they will join as soon as they're able as well. Thank you for blessing us and for the wisdoms that we will receive this evening. We give you praise, all honor, and glory. We ask all blessings in Jesus' name with thanksgiving. Amen. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much for that, Elder King. As you can see, I'm still traveling here on this road, on this freeway, and I'm about a good 5 minutes from home. But what I wanted to do is, as we did last time that we met, just as a reiteration for those of you who were not able to be with us last time, we talked about in the beginning, Dr. Lydia McLean, who was there with us on the line, as well as Dr. Harrington, as well as Dr. James Kyle and Dr. Eric Walsh. Some of the things that we've been talking about is trying to understand just what the vaccination is. And now, there have been a lot of rumors. There have been people who have been saying that this vaccination is a part of the mark of the beast. There's been people that have said that when you get vaccinated, that you're injected with COVID, and all sorts of these different types of misinforming information. And as we talked about last time that we met, we talked about misinformation and disinformation, and that there's a lot of people that are mixing the two. And so we got clarity on what the vaccination is, as Dr. McLean shed light on that. And so what I'd like to ask now, if Dr. McLean, if you can just give a brief synopsis of what you shared on the last time that we met, just a brief synopsis on just what the vaccination is on that. And then we will hear again from some of the questions that you have. I know that Dr. Harrington, we're also looking to you. Again, this is outside of my scope of knowledge and understanding. So we're definitely looking to you to lead us in the information along with the rest of the doctors. And then if there are any questions as that you have, please ask those questions in the chat room. You can raise your hand and we have a chat room so you can text your questions. But I'm just going to ask Dr. McLean if she can give a brief synopsis again on just what is the vaccination, just what is going in our system for those who might have missed it. And I know we did have it live and recorded, but for those who are on the line that are newly joining us tonight that did not get a chance to look at the last recording, if you can explain that to us as we continue on to tonight's meeting.
Thank you, Pastor Chapman, and good evening, everyone, and happy Sabbath to you out there on the West Coast. So just briefly, and when we talk about vaccinations, the whole concept of vaccinations is not something from a therapeutic standpoint that is new to medical science. And if you think of diseases that have been essentially eradicated from, environment, polio, measles, mumps, rubella, chickenpox, we got there because of vaccinations. Essentially, when you talk about a vaccine, you're talking about injecting, something in the body that the body recognizes as not belonging there, so it can mount an immune response to it. In the case, that's just in a very, very high level. As far as the COVID vaccines are concerned, so far we have 3 of these vaccines that have been authorized for use in the United States. The first 2, one developed by a company called Moderna and the other Pfizer. They are called mRNA vaccines. And what I explained the last time we were on the call, what that essentially is that it is not the COVID virus that is injected in anyone's body. It is the messenger RNA, which is something that is made to give the body the code, if you will, the instructions so that the cells in the body can produce something that looks like the spike protein on the virus. It is not the actual virus. It is not the actual spike protein, but it looks like it. So the body, this body that God made for us, that is fearfully and wonderfully made, our immune system reacts to that and responds to that and develops antibodies to that. So instead of actually getting the real disease, you already develop antibodies to this, to the actual virus. So in the event that you are exposed to the real thing, the real virus, and it gets into your body, these antibodies, which are like soldiers, if you want to think about it that way, can now attack that virus and destroy it so it does not make you sick. That's in essence is what a vaccination is. Now, to dispel some of the myths that have been circulating, and there have been a lot of myths and false information, the mRNA vaccines, messenger RNA vaccines, the ones that are developed by Pfizer and Moderna, these two vaccines, they do not change your DNA. DNA is produced, is in the nucleus of the cell. These vaccines, this material has been injected in your arm, is not going into the nucleus of your cell. It enters through the blood vessels in your muscles and is transported into the portion of the cell that manufactures your proteins. The whole idea behind these vaccines is the scientists use what we know about the physiology of the body, how the body manufactures proteins in order to make these vaccines. When the vaccine gets into the body, the mRNA, once it gives that information to the portion of the cell that is going to produce this particular spike protein or spike protein-like thing, it is disintegrated by the natural processes of the body. It cannot enter into your nucleus, it cannot change your DNA, and it only makes that spike protein, does not generate any other proteins or any other things in the body. That's one thing. The other thing that, we've been hearing is that, these vaccines, they have something in you that tracks you, and all of these things are myths, and they are simply false. The vaccines are safe and effective. They've been shown in the clinical trials, and now we've had months and months of experience with the vaccines, with over 150 million people receiving at least one dose and over almost 90 million people receiving 2 doses. They're safe, they're effective, they protect you against actually contracting the virus. And for people who actually, the very small percentage of people who may contract the virus even after they've been vaccinated, because no vaccine is 100%, they've been shown in the clinical trials to be over 90% effective. If you do get it, you would not get very sick. No one has died from getting the vaccine and then subsequently getting infected, as opposed to the over 500,000 people here in the US who have died from the coronavirus. The other vaccine I talked about was the Johnson & Johnson, which is the third vaccine that has been authorized in the US. And we did have sometime last month a pause on distribution of the vaccine because there had been this very, very, again, very rare occurrence of these rare thrombotic events that was covered in six people out of over 7 million people who had gotten the vaccine. So if you can just think mathematically, 6 out of 7 million, how extremely rare that is. You're probably more likely to be struck by lightning, than getting such a rare event from that vaccine. Nevertheless, after the CDC and the FDA looked at the data, they made a determination to allow the vaccine to be put back into circulation with a warning that there is this very, very, very rare possibility. But altogether, the vaccines are safe, they're effective, and they're doing what they're supposed to do, which is allow your body to mount a response. So in the event that you are exposed to the virus, you would not get sick. What happens when you actually get a virus, if you are not vaccinated? Your body mounts some sort of response, but in doing so, some people get very, very sick. We've seen the numbers. We've had over, 3 million people infected. We've had over 500,000 deaths. And people who have had the virus, who succumb and who recover, we also have long-term effects. Lots of people have had pulmonary effects long-term, not able to get off ventilators. People have long-term effects with neurological effects and all of that. So the vaccine is serving, the vaccinations is serving a very, very important role, not just in helping prevent the disease, but it also reducing the likelihood of, if people do actually are exposed to the virus, they would not get very sick. So I'll just stop here. I think that's pretty much in a nutshell what I would like to share about the vaccines. So I see Dave Simmons had something in the chat about the vaccines giving you better immunity than if you actually catch the virus. And so right here, what we're talking about is the immunity that you get from the vaccine versus the natural immunity. And that's exactly correct. Yes, your body may be able to mount a response from catching COVID, but even if you've had COVID, you should still get vaccinated, because with the vaccines, you not only mount a stronger immune response as far as antibody production, but there's also this other element of immunity that we call T-cell immunity, which has to do with the long-term effects of longer term acquired immunity from vaccinations, which you're not going to get from the natural immunity that you would mount if you have been infected with COVID. So David, I hope I answered your question, because you asked what's the why is the vaccine better? Did I answer your question?
You answered my question, but it looks like Sister Hannah has a follow-up question. She's worried.
Well, let me just clarify. It's not artificial immunity. It's your body is mounting an immune response. So that's not probably the best way to say it. You get immunity if you're exposed to a disease, but the chances of getting immunity from exposed to disease, you run the risk of dying. You run the risk of having long-term serious consequences, heart disease, pulmonary complications, neurological complications. That's why vaccinations are what science has been using through perpetuity to rid us of very contagious viral infections. I mentioned polio, measles, mumps, rubella. We are all better off today because of vaccinations. And were it not for vaccinations, a lot of these things would be still running rampant in our society today. In fact, not too long ago, in certain pockets of right here in the United States where we've had these anti-vaxxers and, people who, they don't want the children to get vaccinated and whatnot. We've had pockets of, measles popping up again because of people not wanting to have, their children vaccinated. So the role of vaccinations is critical in terms of ridding our environment and ridding our community of these terrible contagions.
Also, Doctor, if you can repeat the question sometimes for those who may not have the benefit of seeing the question. Thank you.
Got it.
So let me first, before we get too much further on, I'm looking at our list, and we have about 20 folk who have joined today. And so again, welcome to those who've joined since the pastor gave the initial greeting. As I'm listening in, I'm hearing a theme, Dr. McLean, around some confusion about the immune system itself. And I'm wondering if it would be valuable, right, to talk a little bit about this connection between our immune system and why it's sort of inadequate in a little bit deeper way. So for example, there are lots of infections, right? And there are lots of infections that we don't have vaccines for. And we have a vaccine for this infection, and why is it so important, right? And why is this different? Why is this infection different than many of the other infections that we don't have vaccines for, right? And I wonder if you could speak a little bit about that, particularly underscoring the risk of complications, in this disease versus other diseases, right? And the risk of transmission, right? In this disease versus other disease, which actually increases the effect, the profound effect and impact on our health system if a disease like this is spread too broadly, too quickly. And so I think that as I'm listening, I'm hearing this sort of unspoken question about, isn't our own immune system enough, right? Why do we need a vaccine for this? Because our immune system is enough for most infections.
Right. So yeah, absolutely. Because, we don't, just to follow that, thread and that train of thought, we don't have vaccines for the common cold. A common cold is actually caused by a coronavirus. The coronavirus is, it's an umbrella term for lots and lots of viruses, but we don't need vaccines for the common cold because, all of us here on the line have had, common cold, and you snivel and you cough and sneeze for a day or two and it goes away. But unlike the common cold, unfortunately, this particular virus, this specific one, is not something that, number one, gives, but it makes you sick, gives you, a mild disease. It can be lethal. We've seen the numbers, we've seen the statistics. In addition to the lethality of the virus, the transmissibility of the virus is so extreme, is so high that it has wreaked havoc, in our society. That's why, it has spread so rapidly, and within a few months, when it was first discovered, November, December, by March, the WHO was calling this, a global pandemic because of the rapidity of spread. The additional thing about this is that one of the concerning things, in addition to its, transmissibility, and the intense virility of the virus, is the fact that it didn't take. It was not just a situation where patients had to be sick and had to be symptomatic in order to spread it. And this was one of the things that we were not aware of initially when this all started. Because if some of you on the line, may recall, at the very beginning, when this whole issue of masks came about, the initial recommendation that went forth was not that people should be wearing masks. It was if you were sick, if you were coughing, you were sneezing, you wear a mask. Because traditionally, that's the recommendation we have given in the past. So people, if you have the flu, then stay home, stay away from people, cough with the tissue, wear a mask if you have to go out. But if you're not sick, then you don't need to wear a mask. Later on, by the time we started to pick up on what was happening with what we call asymptomatic carriers, meaning people who tested positive, you did a nasal swab, you found that they were carrying the virus, they were infected and had no symptomatology at all, or spent days being infected before they actually came down with symptomatology. These people were spreading the virus hither and yon. So then it became crucial, to change that recommendation to require, or not require, but strongly recommend that people wear masks, because you could be walking around asymptomatic and be carrying this and spreading it because it is so easy to spread. So because of all of these factors, it's not that our bodies, they said before in the beginning, we are fearfully and wonderfully made. There are viruses all around, things hidden there. We do not have a vaccine for every single living contagion that goes around. But you need vaccinations, you need mass vaccinations when you have a situation where you have a pathogen that is lethal, and no one would argue that coronavirus or SARS-CoV-2 is not lethal. Look what is happening in India right now. I mean, I don't even want to look because it is so horrifying to see. This is what happens when the virus is allowed to run rampant. And the idea of mass vaccinations is to try to get to a situation where you have most of the people vaccinated, so you produce what we call, quote unquote, herd immunity or population immunity. So the virus cannot find a host to populate, to multiply and to replicate. So that is why vaccinations is not just important, but it is critical for us to get ahead of this pandemic and to stop it.
Yeah, I appreciate that, detailed explanation. And just to reiterate, the three critical reasons, right, are attached to the virulence of the virus, which is just how likely it is to cause complications, harm, or death, and compared to the common cold and a lot of the other infections that we have. SARS-CoV-2 is extremely virulent in a relative fashion. The other, which I think is really important, is that it's extremely transmissible, very easy to get from one person to another person. And last but not least, which I think is the reason why you get it, even if you as an individual have a low risk of having a complication yourself, and I'll follow up with a question with that in a second, is that you can, unbeknownst to yourself, without having any symptoms, spread it to someone, right, who is susceptible to risk, and then they can have an unfortunate complication, including even death. And so this is, I think, really important for people to understand, because we oftentimes skip over it, I think, as physicians, because it's like really obvious to us, but it's the link of why having our own immune system, per se, which is, as you mentioned, wonderfully made, majestically made, is inadequate to actually control a virus with these three characteristics over a population of people, right? It's so important. So let me follow up with that just a little bit, because I get this question a lot. Well, if you look at the percentages, right, of people infected, and we have an underestimation of the number of people who are actually infected,
Right.
and the actual people who become sick, and then there's a fraction of the people who become sick who actually require an ICU, and a fraction of those, a significant fraction of those, who actually die. So when you work your way back up, right, the majority of people, depending, and if you just look at all comers, right, the majority of people, 95% of people to 99% of people do just fine in the long run. And let's not talk about some of the unknown, long-standing consequences that we don't know yet. So let's just keep that aside, because you and I know that there's a large proportion of people with that, even who have asymptomatic disease. But let's just say in general, what people will say is that for that 95 to 99% of people, their immune system is working well, right? Their immune system must be working well, because they didn't have a complication. They did not require intubation. They did not, go to the hospital or actually die from it. So, isn't my immune system enough? And again, just to reiterate the point you made, what would you say to the person who says that? Like, the majority of people do fine, ultimately, in their mind, and my immune system and their immune system must be pretty good. So why do I need the vaccine?
Yeah. I think that we also have to remember that there is a societal benefit to vaccinations. And it's not just when you get the vaccination, it's not just you, but it's also a societal benefit. And I think part of that is what people are missing. So, yes, I individually, may get the virus and not get sick and I be okay. But there's a societal benefit to mass vaccinations because for the, let's call them for the vulnerable portion of the population that are going to succumb and have a terrible consequence, intubation, mechanical ventilation, long-term consequences, or even death without, as long as you have hosts, you and I, where the virus can find residence and find lodging, you will always have a society that is going to be at risk. And that is why it's important that we all get vaccinated. And if you just want to take it just another step, since we are people of faith, this is a faith-based community, we can say the side of that is, I am my brother's keeper. There is a societal benefit to vaccinations. And that's how I would respond to that.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And again, I think it is so important to think about exactly that. Our community, our families, and remember that we are still susceptible, no matter how great our immune system is, we're still susceptible for getting infected and passing that on to someone else. So I really appreciate that, particularly in an asymptomatic fashion. Let me pause, and I see the pastor has a question. Go ahead.
I did have a question. One of the questions that was ruminating is the fact that our children now I think they made a declaration that children now between the ages of 12 and 15 will be vaccinated. What would you say to the reason being why children younger than 12 are not being vaccinated? And there's a concern from some of the parents that are saying, no, I'm absolutely not vaccinating my child that is under 12. But I think Sister Elder McLean, you, Dr. McLean, alluded to the idea that we do have polio vaccinations and so on and so forth. But with this vaccination in particular, what would you say to the reason why children are not being allowed under 12 to be vaccinated? Because I think that's raising some level of concern. Maybe in the validity of the vaccination. This is where the questioning is coming in.
Okay, so let me speak to the pediatric population a bit. So first of all, the vaccines that have been authorized so far, and I'm using the proper FDA term because they're not fully yet approved. They authorized for the Pfizer for ages 16 and older, and then for the Moderna 18 and older, and Johnson & Johnson 18 and older. Pfizer has just submitted a request to the FDA to amend that authorization to go down to 12 years of age and older. And the reason 12 and older is because they did an additional phase 3 study. They completed that a couple months ago in patients 12 to 15 years of age to look at the immune response when they have been given the virus. So they did a vaccine, sorry, they did a phase 3 study similar to what was done in adults, where they compared a group of vaccinated children, 12 to 15, compared to placebo, which was just, a saline injection. And they saw that the effect was 100%. There were no cases of the COVID virus in all of the children who received the vaccine, whereas there were 18 cases of COVID in the children who received the placebo. And I might just add that when Pfizer did the adult phase 3 program, they did include a small group of children 12 to 15 years of age, but it was not a large enough number. So when they went for authorization the first time, they didn't ask for down to 12. They only asked for age 16 and older. Now they're going to ask for 12 and above. The FDA has not made that formal declaration yet. We've been hearing that the FDA has almost finished reviewing the data and they're about to make an announcement regarding that. But the expectation is that they will allow the authorization to go down to 12 years of age and older. But that is for the Pfizer vaccine. That's the only one so far that is going to be available for children 12 years of age and older. As far as the younger children are concerned, under 12, those studies are still ongoing. We do not have the data yet. Moderna is conducting a program, and they're conducting a full program. When I say full, they're going from phase 1, 2, and 3, similar to what they did in adults, because they have to test different doses in the children at such a young age. So their program is going to span over 6,000 or 7,000 children, going from 6 months all the way up to 11 years of age, looking at different doses, and then they're going to test that out and then go to phase 2 and go to phase 3. So the expectation is that we probably would not have a vaccine ready for children under 11 years of age, not before probably, later on this year, or probably early next year. But the expectation is that we should have something coming out very shortly, meaning a decision by the FDA to allow 12 years of age and older of the Pfizer vaccine. And that would be the only one that would be approved so far for children, and the age would be 12 and older. We do not have the data yet for the under 12.
So this is an extremely important question about children. Pediatricians will be quick to tell you that children are not small adults, and that their physiology and their response to other sorts of embarrassments that we, sort of administer, they get exposed to, is different than an adult. And so it is very responsible. This gets back to a question that was asked last meeting about, can we really trust that they're doing things right? Are they just rushing stuff? And I think the fact that folk are really being methodical and looking at safety and being very explicit about the investigation of these sort of questions speaks to the integrity of the vaccine. Now, a question that came in the chat is a very common question,
right?
And I think it's worth addressing. Since they didn't skip any real steps, right? They just compressed the time, but all the usual stuff, as we talked about last time, that would actually go towards an approval process were done.
Right.
Why is it that the FDA has chosen to maintain, and I'm going to say maintain on purpose, the term emergency authorization, or use for emergency authorization, as opposed to transition that term to approval, particularly since we have such post-marketing and safety data now, right? Because one of the common thoughts and questions that comes up all of the time is it's not FDA approved, and so therefore it can't have the same safety, right, as something that is approved. Emergency authorization, risk benefit, versus really truly approved and therefore safe. Can you comment on that, Dr. McLean?
Right, oh, absolutely. So yes, and that was a question that someone posted in the chat. In fact, I'm leading Lady Ahana says that's the problem. Someone said to me, these vaccines are not approved by the FDA, so they are not taking it. So, so thank you, Lady Ahana, and all the others who are thinking that. So, first of all, let me clarify. It's not a problem. First of all, emergency use authorization, or EUA, is the mechanism, the regulatory mechanism whereby the FDA is able to expedite to allow the distribution of products on the market that have reached the level of the standard of efficacy and safety for use in certain situations. And what are those certain situations? Certain situations would be what we are in right now, in the midst of a pandemic where you have a life-threatening emergencies and you need to move the regulatory process along, not omitting anything about safety and efficacy, doing that risk balance, but allowing the product to be placed on the market without some of the fine-tuning nuts and bolts that go along with what you call a full approval. So what would be the additional fine-tuning that would go on to a full approval? It would be additional long-term, safety data. So recently we just heard that Pfizer has finished collecting all their data out to 6 months. They're continuing to follow patients out for years and years, but they're going to go ahead and submit that information to the FDA to receive the final stamp of full approval. It's a regulatory distinction, but bear in mind that there is no abbreviation of efficacy and safety. When these vaccines were allowed to be placed on the market, they presented the FDA with 2 months of safety data. And why did the advisory panel, why did the antiviral and biologics panel agree that 2 months of safety data was adequate to make a reasoned decision that long-term these vaccines would be safe? Because based on science and based on looking at vaccines over time, over years and years and years and years, we know that most of any serious effects of a vaccine presents itself within the first 4 to 6 weeks of administration. So that is why the panel was accepted 2 months of safety data to make that determination of adequate risk benefit being established. Full approval is going to come with the 6 months data that they now have. And I think they're in the process, or they have already submitted the application for full approval. But it's not, and I would hope people, would not look at it in the concept of, well, it's a problem. Technically, yes, if you want to say it's not approved, yes, technically it is not approved in terms of full approval by the FDA, but it has reached the standard for safety and efficacy that is essentially the same risk-benefit assessment that goes on into an assessment for full approval. I hope that helps to clarify.
Pastor, you were going to make, if it's a different question, Pastor. Is it different? Okay, go ahead. You need to unmute yourself, Pastor.
Sorry about that. Not a different question. I just wanted to pause for those who are just joining us, and I might have missed the introduction that we do have Dr. Harrington, who was with us on this call and this Zoom call, and we have Dr. McLean. I do not see Dr. Kyle on the line today at this point for Zoom, and I do not see Dr. Walsh, but those that we do have with us right now is Dr. Lydia Gilbert McLean. For those who did not get the flyer and did not have her information, she is a lung pulmonologist and critical care medicine physician. She is board certified in internal medicine and pulmonary disease and critical care medicine. She's accomplished her leadership in regulatory science and drug development for over 21 years. She's also working with the NIH and the FDA, and she's been doing that for the past 10 years. Of course, we have our very own Daryl W. I'm about to rename you. Brother Daryl Harrington. Dr. Harrington, who's been with us, a graduate of medical education and designated institutional official at Harbor UCLA Medical Center. And Dr. Harrington is currently serves as a member of the Normandy Avenue Health Team Ministry. And he's also he's had oversight and provided support for more than 500 trainees and 51 of his sponsors residency and fellowship programs. I'm just giving you a synopsis of what Dr. Harrington and Dr. McLean have done for those of you who are just joining us and were not able to join us in the first meeting that we had. We do not have with us Dr. James Kyle at this time and Dr. Walston. So if you were with us last time and you're wondering where they were not able to join us at this time for our Zoom call. But right now we have with us Dr. Harrington, who is extremely efficient and effective in his field of work, as well as Dr. McLean. So I just wanted to give that disclaimer, Doctor, and let folks know exactly what we're doing and what's going on. I'm turning it back over to you.
Well, I appreciate that. So the good thing about, I guess, having Dr. McLean and myself on the call is I think she and I are the two of the four doctors who actually have been and are taking care of patients who have COVID during this time and not spending time just in administration. And so we have firsthand knowledge of that. And so that's always sort of good. Well, she's worked on the regulatory side. I've been involved with Los Angeles County planning for public health abroad as it relates to COVID and our COVID response here in LA, as I think many folk know. Let me follow up on the question that was just asked and the answer that was given about why isn't this approved yet? You know, it's still EUA. Emergency use authorization designation as opposed to approved. And I appreciate Dr. McLean's commentary that if you look at the standard for approval, that standard, and she knows better than any of us, she knows what the regulatory standard is for approval from the FDA. She's worked in that for over a couple of decades. And so that standard's been met. From a regulatory efficiency standpoint of view, when the pandemic hit, the most efficient pathway to get the vaccine to the public was the EUA. It's as simple as that. That is the pathway to get the quickest pathway to get a safe therapeutic to the public. As long as there is an emergency, as long as there's a pandemic, the EUA will be in effect. Unless there's a real public outcry or a real push by the manufacturer to have full approval, an EUA will serve as the method or the authority to continue to distribute the medication as long as the criteria of an emergency use is still met. And we still actually meet the criteria for emergency use, right? So I appreciate that, Dr. McLean. And I don't know that either of our explanations will completely help, but I do know that as Sister Ahana suggested, it is part of the vernacular that we're having to live with that actually does provide some pause to many people. All right, so I have a list of questions, but I'm gonna pause for a second and see if those of the audience have a question. You can put it in the chat. I see that there isn't anything in the chat. If people want to talk or ask a question live, you can unmute yourself and just go ahead and ask, and maybe even share your video if you like. So I'll just pause for a moment. David?
Yes, Dr. Harrington. At my job, we have an interesting situation. We're starting to call folks back to work, as some of the people who have been vaccinated have expressed concern about working with people who have not been vaccinated. They're saying they don't want to, they went through trouble getting vaccinated. And these people did not go through trouble getting vaccinated. They may bring some type of mutant variant of the virus. And so is that a legit concern or something else?
Well, that's a good question. And let me paraphrase that a little bit so we can get the broader answer. So the fear, or the basis of that fear, is that the vaccine doesn't protect against some of the other viruses, the other strains of the viruses that are out there. They're circulating popularly, in California or in the US. And as we've talked about before, there are multiple strains of the virus that are now actually present in the US, right, that people have documented. And so the concern Dr. McLean, is, hey, I've been vaccinated, but these people who haven't been vaccinated, they're going to get some strain that certainly isn't protected by the vaccine, and then I'm going to get infected all over again. Okay, so what do we say about how protective these vaccines are to a number of the mutant strains that have been identified in the US? Let's stick to the US first.
Right. Well, so far from the data that we have, at least specifically for the Pfizer and the Moderna, I don't want to speak at the top of my head about Johnson & Johnson because Pfizer, Moderna is the one that I've been following most closely. They seem to offer, significant protection against most of the variants that we do have in the US. So for someone who is concerned, about the circulating variants and who have already been vaccinated and concerned that they may get infected with a variant, I think that the risk of what we call a breakthrough, infection is not increased, in any way because of the presence of the variant. We had spoken before earlier that, no vaccination is 100%. And, there are, a few cases of, of breakthrough infections, but those are very, very rare. The CDC put out some data a couple of weeks ago, and, that percentage is like 0.0007%, very, very small. So the likelihood of someone getting, a secondary infection, post-vaccination is very low. Still, at the same time, because we are, in the midst of a pandemic, and, I would encourage people still to continue to do the things that you would do if you're in an environment with a group of people who are not vaccinated. Even if you are vaccinated, still wear your mask, still do your social distance, wash your hands, and still do all of those things. And that would be what I would recommend.
Dave, does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah. So again, this is extremely important. I think the data was generated from the state of Washington in terms of breakthrough infections. And, again, we're talking about 1/10 of a percent, right? Less than 1/10 of a percent is the likelihood that you will get infected if you've been successfully vaccinated. So that's exceedingly low. And it's news to what we thought 6 months ago. 6 months ago, we thought, well, there's still even a significant chance that you could get infected, but just a low chance that you'd have complications, right? Or go to the hospital. And we thought that was it. Like your risk of infection was still significant. But now we know that your risk of infection, at least what we call, again, the term is breakthrough infection, is extremely low. And I do like you adding the comments, Dr. McLean, about even though the breakthrough infection rate is so low, it is still prudent to protect yourself, to wear a mask. And again, when you protect yourself, you're protecting others. And I think that's prudent, particularly in high-risk situations. And high-risk situations typically are places where you can't maintain distance between people and there's poor ventilation. Okay. This idea, and maybe I'll just stretch this question a little bit. The idea that we've learned so much more now than before, that people can walk comfortably outside, for example, without a mask, particularly if you've been vaccinated, is absolutely, right? Absolutely. There's been precaution fatigue. People feel like they just can't breathe. It is completely safe, particularly if you've been vaccinated, to walk outside in the fresh air without a mask, okay? And the CDC updated guidelines have actually done a nice job of, I think, trying to be more informed as we've learned more about the public health and public safety data. Okay, I see Hope shared a video, and so did Pam. Do you guys have questions?
Yes, I have one question. LSU in the school district is requiring that children have a nasal swab weekly for school. So I was just blown away by that because I know my niece took her child to a place where she got the swab in the mouth, and the school refused to accept that. So what is your comment about that? Because that just kind of bothers you. The children have to suffer weekly, no symptoms. So speak to that, please.
So I can take a stab at that real quick. So there's sort of two parts of this. One is where is the virus most successfully recovered, right? And then the second part of your question is this strategy of surveillance, okay? Surveillance strategy. So with regard to recovering the virus from a swab, the anterior nares is more reliable of recovering a swab, of recovering a specimen or the actual virus or the virus particle than the mouth. And that's for a number of reasons. Partly is, particularly in young folk, they will not allow people to put the swab into the posterior pharynx where the virus is more likely to be. And so getting a really good sample requires putting the swab all the way in the back of the mouth, not just in the buccal mucosa, just inside the mouth. And again, the compliance with that is actually not great. So it's much more reliable to actually do a swab in the anterior nares, or the anterior nose, than the mouth. So reliability is one reason why, if you were testing with some reliability, relying on accuracy of the specimen, you would actually prefer a nasal swab than a mouth swab. Okay. Now, with regard to surveillance strategies are all over the place. And if you look at the CDC has not prescribed a very specific surveillance strategy that must be followed in all circumstances of education. And so what you'll see is that surveillance strategies will vary dramatically based on resources, okay, of the school, based on the appetite of safety, if you will, for the environment, for the organization, for the population, the parents, etc. And so you'll see, for example, school protocols that look like the NBA, okay, where people are getting swabbed once a week, like they did when they were in the bubble. You'll see people who will actually require not just surveillance swabbing, but people that have to have proof of vaccination before going to school. So for example, my daughter, Isabella, you all know her, she's graduating, but when she comes back in the fall, it will be a requirement for all enrolled students who want to take in-person learning to be vaccinated. And they can impose that. Okay, it's a private university, they can impose that. So the answer is there's not one size fits all for surveillance. People actually have a choice to provide a surveillance recommendation, if you will. There is probably no rational reason to provide more frequent surveillance than once a week or once every 10 days, just because of the doubling time, if you will, of the virus. Meaning if I got exposed today, the chances that I would be able to pick it up in my nasal specimen would be 4 to 7 days later. You would not be able to pick it up tomorrow or 48 hours. So it takes some time for it to be detectable. So that's why there's a sort of this 1 week period, but people will sort of make stuff up because they can. And right now the CDC is not providing a one size fits all recommendation for surveillance.
So the CDC has nothing for children because that nasal thing is very painful when they get it weekly. Okay, so my next question is, my husband has to get it tested monthly, even though he's fully vaccinated.
Yeah, so what I will say, and I'm sure this will bring a smile to Dr. McLean's face, our behavior and our practice doesn't always align with our knowledge, right? And this is the sluggishness of protocol and policies, if you will, with our knowledge. We learn things at a rate faster than we can implement changes in our procedure and policy. So for example, even our public health guidelines from the CDC and from the state around the country have not caught up with what we know about the data and transmissibility. Sometimes it takes a month 2 or 3 months before they really catch up and change policy and practice. I would argue that once people sort of generally accept, both emotionally and intellectually, remember, this is not just an intellectual response to a protocol, it's also an emotional one, right? So even though we told you that less than 0.1% of people will have a breakthrough infection, and if that's the case, why would you continue to swab or provide surveillance to vaccinated people, right? Well, that's the data, but people are still emotionally, right? 6 months ago, where we said the vaccine doesn't protect against infection, it only protects against complications. So people emotionally are still there. They're not caught up to our intellectual knowledge. So it will be a little while, but I guarantee you that the surveillance policies will change for vaccine. It'll just take a little time. But there's always a delay between knowledge and practice.
Thank you.
Do you agree, Dr. McLean?
Yes, definitely. Yeah, makes sense. Yeah. The policies always lag behind, the data and the knowledge. It takes a little while for things to catch up.
I will say in this vein, and Dr. McLean, this is an opinion question, so I'm going to warn you, okay? But I am hearing more and more projected that a lot of the privileges that we enjoy as citizens, travel, admittance to, sports events and venues, et cetera, that they are thinking very heavily about tying this to vaccination status.
Yeah.
Do you have thoughts about that, an opinion about what's the likelihood of that actually happening or not happening?
Well, my opinion on that is I hope that happens because I think that there should be people who are, willing to, do good by themselves and by society should at least, have some reward, if you will, And also, I think that just because, the science bodes so well for the benefits of vaccinations, I think that if we add that additional carrot, if you will, to, tying vaccinations to, the travel and sporting events and so forth, it would probably help to the people who are still on the fence and, want to just to drag their feet along. Maybe that would be the impetus that pushes them over to get, to get vaccinated. And for me, I think it would be just for my own comfort. My family and I, we do a lot of traveling, we do a lot of cruising and so forth, and we're ready and willing, to go back on. But I wouldn't want to go on a cruise ship if I know that there could be 50% of the people on the cruise ship not vaccinated or the crew not vaccinated. I'll be very uncomfortable, but I'll be quite comfortable if I know that everyone on that ship is vaccinated. So I am all for that policy.
Yeah, I'm sorry to put you in the spotlight, but I appreciate your candor because I think it's going to come to a reality at some level, and some privilege will be tied to the vaccine. In the chat is a question that is sort of attached to what we're talking about. It's this idea that if you're not vaccinated, what real risk should you be taking? And so the specific question in the chat is, should I wear a mask at home and around my yard if I haven't been vaccinated? And the easy answer to that is, unless everyone and every member in your household is in the bubble and is protected and stays in the bubble, or they're vaccinated, then you trust no one, okay? It's as simple as that. You trust no one. If your household is in a bubble and you know exactly where they go and they remain safe, etc., or everyone in your household is vaccinated but you, then you're safe, okay? Then you're safe. That's probably a very rare circumstance. Having said that, let's expand that question about sort of not being vaccinated. And Dr. McLean has taken care of a bunch of people in the ICU. I've taken care of a bunch of people in the hospital and the ICU as well. And you guys have heard this from me. I have not prompted Dr. McLean. So I'm going to ask her a question that I've answered before, but you'll now have two different people who independently, hopefully, will actually be aligned with what we're going to say. Dr. McLean, how many people have you taken care of who do not have the traditional typical risk factors, okay, who've been very sick, who you might otherwise say to yourself, man, I wouldn't have thought this person would have a complication, be sick in the ICU, be ventilated, etc., or die. Have you taken care of someone who wasn't morbidly obese, who didn't have severe diabetes or complications, or some chronic other disease? Have you taken care of someone who was otherwise sort of walking and talking, healthy person who got sick with this virus?
Unfortunately and sadly, yes, I have, and actually, and I'm right top of my mind, I can just think of, like, 2 or 3 people, like that, who, in fact, the last very sad case that, that we had, a young man, young, in his mid-40s, strapped, healthy guy, no underlying conditions, no diabetes, no hypertension, and got COVID. And, was admitted to the hospital, was first on the regular floor, then just got progressively worse and worse, come to the ICU, got intubated, and just went downhill. He got everything, remdesivir, tocilizumab, proning, you name it. And we couldn't get him off the ventilator, but had no underlying risk factors, the typical things you hear about, obesity, chronic lung disease. He didn't have that. So there are people who have no underlying disease, who are previously healthy, who get COVID and can get very, very, very sick and have very, very bad outcomes. So yes, I've seen that.
Yeah, and I asked that question primarily because for those of us who consider ourselves healthy, and not in the typical risk groups, I hear a lot of, well, either I'm not at risk, I'm not going to have a complication, and along with my brother and my sister's keeper piece, that does not mean that you're not at risk. And so just hearing it independently from another physician who's taking care of COVID patients, even though your risk isn't as high as if you were to have all those risk factors, you still have a risk. Now, in the chat, I know is a question related to something that came in the news over the last week or so that talked about the complications or the risk of reproduction and infertility, right, associated with the vaccine or vaccines, the COVID vaccines. So I'm wondering, Dr. McLean, you might be already typing a response in the chat already, but I'm wondering if you would address this issue. Again, my son, my teenage son brought this up to me because it's all over the news.
Yeah, I mean, I was reading something about that the other day, and well, first of all, there are no scientific data in terms of preclinical studies, the clinical studies, that support any of that. And going back, doing a little deep dive into, where this might be coming from, there is some, I read something about, there is some concern that the spike protein has some similarities to, you mean some of the proteins related to the placenta or something like that. I'm not sure, Dr. Harrington, if you aware of what I'm talking about, but there is no correlation, with the vaccine and that. And then the other question that was raised was, if there's concern that the vaccine does this, then what about, the real virus? Why is the real, what is the effects of the real virus itself, on the reproductive system. And that is being studied, right now as we speak. But as far as I know, scientifically, from terms of the vaccine itself, there are already no data to support that. And that is some theory that is being circulating and, and has been going around.
Yeah, as I understand it, it came from a reasonably well-respected German scientist, right, who wrote about this theoretical similarity, right, as you mentioned, between a molecule in the COVID molecule, or the COVID surface protein, and the placenta. And the conjecture was that because of the similarity, in theory, and that's how it was written, sort of in theory, this could happen and cause infertility. And it went from someone writing about theoretical supposition to it actually happening. And here's the problem, and I'm going to say this for everyone. Whenever you have a vaccine now that is as prevalent as it is in our population, okay? So, we are about a third of folk have the vaccine now.
Yeah.
That's over 100 million people in the United States. So just think about this, guys. If you have 100 million people who have something in common called a vaccine, and in that population, you see an incidence, meaning a new event of 20 cases of whatever it is, okay? It is easy to say, hey, we just saw 20 cases of XYZ in these people who are vaccinated. Now, in order for you to know, or for you to think that that might be related to the vaccine, even though over 100 million people, that's pretty uncommon, you would actually have to know the incident of those complications or that event in the unvaccinated people. So then you can compare. So if you had 20 people who had miscarriages, or who are who are infertile, who are in this 100 million, and probably let's just say 40 million were, or 20 million were women who could conceive, then you would actually have to look at the rate of infertility, right, and miscarriages in 20 million women who are not vaccinated. And if that rate was higher in the vaccinated group, then you could say it may be attached to the vaccine. We need to look into it. But like the clots that Dr. McLean talked about earlier, and I think the FDA did a nice job of just trying to provide some precaution, but the epidemiologists did not see a higher rate of this specific type of clot, even though it's an uncommon clot in the brain. They did not see a higher proportion or prevalence of that clot in the same number of people, if you will, sort of matched in non-vaccinated population, right? But they were, I think, again, this is to the integrity and the responsibility, they still put a warning, which I think is not clever. I think it's responsible, right? But again, the science is really clear that there's really no difference in the incidence or prevalence of that. So I think it's really important. Okay, let's see. Do we have other questions in the chat? We're coming up on our hour here. Let's see.
I do have a question.
Yep.
I do have one more question. Okay, so as y'all see, my wife is with me here. I had a question in terms of just overall, generally, and this is to Dr. McLean and Dr. There are people that are really figuring that vaccination is tied to that. One of the reasons why people are pushing the vaccination and even working with the FDA and CDC and whatnot is that this is a political move by the government. This is something that I've heard on the thread as well. I'm being enlightened as we've had this conversation prior to this forum now. But what would you say to someone who is giving the disinformation and even misinformation that this is possibly tied to the government, and this is all for political gain, if you will. What would you say to someone who would say that?
I think
Well, go ahead.
just before you answer, Dr. McLean, I want to be sure. I'm not sure everyone heard.
Yeah.
You're saying that it's tied to the government, correct?
Tied
The
to
vaccines.
the vaccination. I asked the question again I'm throwing both of you, that this vaccination is tied to some type of political gain. That the reason why they're wanting to get so many people vaccinated is so that they could come up with another government or governmental scheme, if you will, that this is only for political gain. This is only for the profit of Pfizer, of Moderna, and of Johnson. That not
Okay.
really of vaccination, more or less, but it's for the benefit of political gain or for governmental type of, and this is a prelude to something else. I've heard this more than one time, and more or less people are feeling that I've heard have these conversations with, that this vaccination is not for the sake of vaccination, but it's for political gain.
Okay. Go ahead, Dr. McLean. I'll give you first
Well,
pass at that.
don't know. Yeah, I don't know what I would say in the face of 30 million people in the United States infected, over 500,000 dead, and you know, our economy in shatters. Life has been, you know, upended. So I wouldn't know if in seeing all of this in front of them, saying that, you know, it's for political gain. I don't, you know, I don't know what would be. Why would anyone think that? You know, again, going back to what I said at the beginning, the whole idea of the principle of vaccination is not something that is new. It's one of the therapeutic models that has proven to be over time to be one of the safest and one of the most effective in eradicating transmissible lethal diseases. You know, we can go back to the old days of polio and measles and mumps and rubella, but were it not for vaccinations. And as we shared at the very beginning, the reason why we need the vaccination for this virus is because of its lethality, its easy, you know, its transmissibility, and, you know, its deadliness, and the fact that without something rapid, yes, we can all wait and get the virus and get the disease, but more and more people would die. Our economy would never recover. Our children's lives would never get back to normal. And that is why we need to, you know, to do this. The alternative to me is not an option. We've seen the death toll has come down significantly now that we've started to ramp up vaccinations. We can go back to January 2021, where we were having an average of 3,000 deaths a day. And if that doesn't make someone stop and think, then I don't know what will.
Yeah, I agree with Dr. McLean 100%, and I might just add that you don't actually have to argue against the question that's being asked to make valid the need for the vaccine. In other words, the government or politicians, let's just say people, right, manipulate and manage and do all sorts of things with all sorts of factual pieces of information. So just because there may be possible that someone's profiting from this, that's possible. It is possible, although I doubt it, but it's possible. I'm not going to argue. I don't know, Dr. McLean, we don't know for sure. It's possible that someone might use this for a party re-election or to be an anti-Trumper or whatever. I mean, all of that's very possible. But what is real, as Dr. McLean said, is that with all those things being possible, people really have died and will die from this disease. This vaccine actually does work to prevent that from happening. That's a fact. Whether someone wants to use that for political gain or not, have at it. but the vaccine and its efficacy and its safety is independent of what someone wants to do with the facts, right? So I think we have to be very careful when we get into conversations about the vaccine, particularly with people who have hesitancy or have strong opinions. I think we have to be very careful about trying to argue against a perspective or a curiosity or a question that may actually not even be relevant, if you will. It's not relevant, but they're attaching it to make it relevant. And so what we should do is try to point out, well, let's talk about why that might be relevant to the vaccine, or does the political manipulation or advantages or the profiteering from this, does it change the facts about this disease? Does it change the fact about this vaccine? Does it change the fact that you are susceptible, or your mother, or your sister, or your child, right? It doesn't change any of that, despite possible profiteering and politics aside. So I think we have to be very careful, because when we don't separate things, what you'll end up is on a rabbit hole, a tangential rabbit hole argument about someone's opinions about the government, and you will never get to the main point or the main discussion, which is their safety, your safety, and the world's safety around us, right?
Thank you. Thank you.
Good evening. Good evening. I have Brother Coleman here. I have a couple of questions here.
Sure.
If you don't mind.
Go, please.
Okay, so regarding COVID, has SARS-CoV-19 ever been isolated? And regarding the 500,000 plus deaths in the U.S., is that in addition to the regular death rates, annual death rates? And, in the 3 million globally or worldwide, is that also, in addition to the annual death rates that we would normally have? The next question is, commenting on the getting rid of polio and mumps and rubella and all that stuff. There was a report done, I think it was the Health and Human Services in New York State, where they tried saliva, putting people together that had, polio and these different diseases. And they said that it wasn't contagious, or they concluded that it wasn't contagious, and that vaccines did not eradicate it. And that was back in, I want to say 76, but I'm not, don't quote me on the year. It was mentioned that this vaccine was created quickly, or in a rush because of the situation or the emergency pandemic. Normally, it would take a vaccine study 7, 10, maybe 15 years to really prove the safety and efficacy. This was done quickly. And from my understanding, Dr. I think Gillum mentioned, it was based off of the genome sequencing from China. That genome sequencing from China would be in silico-based whole genome phylogenetic analysis of a novel coronavirus, which would, in silico meaning computer simulation. And if we're dealing with computer simulation, that has proven in the past to be inaccurate regarding even the projected death rates. 10 million people are going to die in America, 100 million in a couple of months. That didn't happen. There's been reports by the VAERS, which is the Vaccine Emergency, reporting system, almost 4,000 deaths directly related to the vaccines, and I guess about 68,000 plus injuries. That's the VAERS reporting system, which, from my understanding, less than 1% is really reported, which is also disturbing. There's been reports that women who have the vaccine have been suffering from menstrual irregularities, reproductive dysfunction. Some women, entire decidual cast, which is the entire inside of the uterus, just slides off, which is disturbing. In men, ED, swelling of the scrotum. And I want to ask this, I'm just going to end it with this one. With the nasal swab that they're about to give the children in schools, I want to know if anyone has heard of any reports of DARPA and the military, or just DARPA itself, having any association with either the production or the testing or the vaccine itself, because there's reports that the nasal swab, which they're using to penetrate the blood-brain barrier to look for COVID, when you put some of these swabs under a microscope or a high, resolution camera, they're DARPA hollow nylon fibers. They're spiky fibers. They're not cotton swab like a Q-tip that you use to clean your ears from home. And the hollow nylon fibers contain DARPA hydrogel beads. That's another disturbing find that a lot of these doctors from the World Doctors Alliance, which is doctors from all over the world, have combined to try to, shed some light on what they're experiencing. And they formed that because they weren't getting any, exposure regarding what was going on and what they're finding. So the DARPA hollow nylon fibers contain DARPA hydrogel beads, which when you look into that, that's really disturbing. There's been reports that DARPA has been trying to isolate the C8 or chromosome 8, which is a gene directly related to love, empathy, compassion, divinity. They've studied people with religious association, studied atheists. They've noticed when they read scripture, religious people or Christians had a certain activity in that region of the brain. And that meeting was about how to neutralize that and these people, because they're now going to be considered extremists. And they said one of the methods they have and could deploy is some type of respiratory virus. So I want to hear, is anyone familiar with any of this, or even the World Doctors Alliance?
Yeah, so, well, first of all, thank you for those questions. It was more than a mouthful. We'll try to remember a few of them and answer a few of them because there are a lot of them, and some of them actually are, I would say, kind of grouped together. I think Dr. McLean was probably writing or taking a few notes as well. So we'll kind of tag team and go back and forth a little bit. The first question I think I heard you ask was this, I think a fundamental question about whether or not the virus itself, the actual virus, has been actually identified and isolated. And there is something called Koch postulates, KOCH, Koch postulates. It's a microbiological, right? It's a microbiological sort of, not sort of rule, but sort of proceduring, if you will, that allows for us to talk about microorganisms in a way that's reliable, reproducible, et cetera, right? And back in, I know from what I recall, back in the fall, winter of last year, there was beginning circulations of folk who were very concerned and began writing about this in both some interesting news outlets as well as social media, that the virus, in fact, had never been isolated. Therefore, how could there be a vaccine, right? And then I've seen that multiplied over and over again. The facts are, I'm not a virologist, but the facts are that the virus has been isolated over and over again, not just by like CDC and labs like that, but it's been isolated even in research labs here. Now, I work at UCLA, we actually have the virus in our lab because we actually have vaccine research going on. In the Lundquist Institute at Harbor UCLA, where we actually have isolated the virus there in a little small research lab in Torrance, because they're doing novel vaccine creation as well. So I will tell you that the virus itself has been isolated from live tissue, not just from animals, but from live tissue as well as post-mortem, which is, I think, an important sort of question. The related question I think I heard with that was a sort of notion of how many people have really died. And I think that's a really good question because we don't know how death certificates are always completed. Okay, both Dr. McLean and I have actively been taking care of patients ourselves and have had to, unfortunately, I can speak for myself, have had to sign death certificates. And you are right. I will tell you that you're absolutely correct that there are, when you sign a death certificate, it actually has immediate cause of death. It actually has primary, secondary, and contributing causes of death, right? And so I am not specifically aware of how they've done the statistics in from an epidemiological standpoint of view in terms of which data is abstracted from the death certificates to give them the numbers. I don't know that. I do know that people do sometimes count someone who actually has COVID-19, as an example, as a contributing cause or something present at the time of death, that could get counted as a cause of death. In LA County, where I've been really involved with this from the public health department, there is a procedure here in LA County where we do not allow the counting of someone dying from COVID-19 if it's on your death certificate. It actually has to be a proximate cause of death. It has to be a proximate cause of death. And that gets verified in a sampling. They don't actually verify every single one, but they actually go through charts and go through a sampling to make sure that we're getting at least reasonable data, if you will, reasonable data. So I think it's a good question. I can't tell you that the 500,000 deaths are accurate, but I would say that if we're off, we're not off by orders of magnitude. In other words, I don't believe that the reported 500,000 plus is really 5,000, because I can tell you in my hospital, the people I took care of myself, which is just one hospital, of hundreds of people who actually died from COVID, right? Who were sick, diagnosed, in the ICU, couldn't breathe, could not be taken off a ventilator and died, right? And that's just one hospital. So it is certainly a real disease responsible for, I think, hundreds of thousands of people actually dying. Whether or not every death is counted accurately or not, who knows? But it is certainly not off by an order of magnitude. Okay, so that's why I could tell you, working directly with patients, having to sign death certificates, and working in the Department of Public Health here in Los Angeles. Okay, I don't know if Dr. McLean is still with us there. I was going to tag team any of this. Let's see, there she is. So the sort of next questions were a group of questions related to reports, right?
Well,
and there are lots of reports.
Yeah, I can't, I really can't speak to that, so I'm not going to speak to that at all. I am just going to mention just briefly, because there was a whole, lot of questions and a lot of different topics there, but something about the speed of vaccine development, that normally it takes, 5, 10, 15 years, and that's true. But, as I shared earlier on the call and on the last call that we had, explain some of the things that went into making this process move along more quickly. Not that any steps were missed. The vaccine development process still went through the full 3 phases of development, phase 1, 2, and 3. They were all compressed. Several factors involved in helping to move things along is that things were done sequentially. Data was looked at, as the trial was going on, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. The typical scenario where one does a phase 1 study, do safety, then get all the data, take it to the FDA, they look at it and then decide, okay, now go on to phase 2, look at it, go back, look at it and say, okay, now go on to phase 3. All that did not happen for this. They were able to move things along in a compressed and efficient way because the fact of the matter is that we were in a pandemic and people were dying. But the fact that we went along quickly does not mean that steps were missed. Steps were not missed. People were able to be enrolled in the clinical trial very quickly, and in less than a month or 2, they were able to enroll 30,000, 40,000 patients in the clinical trials. Normally, it takes years and years to enroll in a clinical trial because people take the time. Enrollment, recruitment as necessarily slow. This was not the case for the for the COVID trials. And then added to that, the fact that the government went ahead and allowed the manufacturers to, pay the manufacturers so that they could actually go ahead and scale up manufacturing. So they had the manufacturing completed even before the clinical trials were done. It was a risk, but the idea was once we have a decision on safety and efficacy from these clinical trials, we were not going to wait another 6 months for the vaccine to be manufactured upscale. You would have it ready to get out the door, right away, all because we were in the midst of a pandemic. So there was things that were done to expedite things, but the fact that it was done expeditiously does not mean that steps were missed and the safety and efficacy was not assured. So that's what I'll add to that add to this conversation. And it's 9:03. I'm not sure how much longer we had to be on the call, but
Yeah.
I need to get off.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So I will just say very quickly, and then we'll try to wrap up here. We really appreciate your time, Dr. McLean, and we've been going pretty good for almost an hour and a half, which is quite good. There are a lot of questions in that. The last question, I will say that there are lots of reports of, lots of rumors of, and I think that we should be thoughtful and careful to think about them. I can make myself certainly available to folk, and once a month I hold a meeting with our health and ministries to answer a variety of type of questions like this as well when we have time to go in more detail. So Brother Coleman, you can certainly actually contact me directly as well. We could talk some more about that. I want
no problem.
Okay, because they're really, I think, really important questions that you have. I have some input. I'm kind of familiar with a lot of, particularly the DARPA concern that people have been raising. I'm very familiar with that, and I'd like to provide you some of that information. So please contact me and we can talk about that. Let me just say, yeah, absolutely. Let me just say for everyone, we've had 34 folk here who stuck it out with us over time. There's a lot of really great discussion, great information. People are very patient and we appreciate that. I just want to tell Dr. McLean, Gilbert McLean, a special thank you for coming back to join us and share her expertise and knowledge and wisdom and opinions even when necessary. They're tremendously valuable to me and I hope to everyone else here. And I want to thank you all for the opportunity to join us. At this time, I'm going to turn it back over to the pastor who will close us out here. And until next time, again, we will have a monthly talk that's sort of hosted by our health and ministries leader anyway, related to COVID updates. Pastor?
Thank you both, Dr. Harrington, for such an excellent moderating and just the information that you have given and just your dedication to this entire cause. I think that over time, as you've been on the line and you've had the opportunity, afforded many people the opportunity to come on and to ask questions and to give updates during the pandemic, I think it's been really important and it's been an awesome thing. So I thank you, Dr. Harrington, for all of your resources and all the information and wisdom that you've given. I think this has been an awesome job that everyone has done. I want to thank special thanks again to Dr. Kyle, who came on to our last meeting, as well as Dr. Eric Walsh. And last but definitely not least, Dr. Lydia McLean. You have given some very valuable and very volatile information. I think that this is information that we definitely need. There's no reason for anyone to go and spread any misinformation or disinformation at all. I think that this information that we were given was the correct information and it was the needed information. Now, from this point, I'm asking for anyone who decides to get the vaccination to actually utilize the information that was given to you over the past 2 meetings that we've had. In the future, we might even look to possibly using our church as a vaccination site. But before we get to that point, I do want people to really research the information that you've been given today and the last meeting that we've had, because I think that it's a life and death situation. It's a very life and death situation. We're out and we'll close out with prayer. I also want to cover all of our nurses, all of our leaders, all of the folks in the medical field, all of the people that are on the front lines. As you heard, Dr. Harrington and Dr. McLean are on the front line still. I mean, actually having to sign death certificates of people that have died from COVID. This is a very psychological, emotionally draining thing. And I'm quite sure that days that you all go in can be tough. And so we want to make sure that we cover you tonight as we did before. And remember, all of those that are on the front line in prayer. All right, so let's close out tonight. Thank you all for joining, and I'm hoping that you were able to take something away from here that you did not have before. Let's pray. Father in heaven, we thank you for the information that was dispensed tonight. We thank you for Dr. Harrington and Dr. McLean, Dr. James Kyle, and Dr. Eric Walsh, who was with us before for this doctor's forum. Lord, we're praying that you would just give us the insight and the foresight that we need to make the right decision. Ultimately, Lord, everything comes to how we follow your lead. Nothing that we say or do will be a good idea, but everything that was said and done will be a God-centered idea. Now I'm asking that you will cover Dr. Harrington and Dr. McLean as they are still on the front line. Be with all of our medical professionals, be with all of our medical leaders, all of our nurses, all of our doctors, all of our trainees, everyone, Lord, that is on these front lines combating this pandemic. We're praying, Lord, that you will bless us and keep us until we meet each other again. In Jesus' name, we pray. Amen. Thank you again for all.
Amen.
Thank you all again for joining the Avenue. And this has been recorded. We also have known that it's been brought to our attention that our regional director will now utilize this information throughout the GLAR region. And so now GLAR will be a part of what we've started here, as Normandy Avenue has been the catalyst for this information with our doctors. So God bless you. May you have the rest, a great rest of the day, as well as Sabbath. Do not forget, tomorrow morning at 8:30, we will have our car wash there for those mothers who want to get their car all cleaned up and hooked for Mother's Day. We'll have that right there in the parking lot. Thank you again, Brother Moody, for all of your hard work and dedication, and all of the men ministry. Women, y'all up for Father's Day. I hope you're ready for Father's Day, because it seemed like I don't know because we've done our thing. So God bless all of you, and you have a good time, a good rest of the evening. Look forward to seeing you next week.
And also, one more thing, commercial break. Dr. Harrington will be doing the health class May 18th at 7 p.m. and it is on the chat. The ID number is there. Thank you very much. You're all welcome to join us.
Thank you, Sister Simmons, as well as Brother Simmons, who also reached out to everyone and has been pushing this battle. Thank you again, and God bless.